Okay, good morning. I set my alarm. I was gonna try to make like a 3 a.m. Creepy notes video because all my kid is watching on YouTube right now is don't play Minecraft at 3 in the morning. So I was gonna do like a don't take notes at 3 in the morning video, but that didn't happen, and now it's 10:30 and I just woke up. So that's how things are going. And my kid's favorite song right now is the theme song from the Halloween horror movies. So I don't know how that happened. I'm not doing a good job parenting right now, but that's okay. Um, so here we are. We finished last unit. We were going to do a lot more with all the organic molecules that we talked about. We were going to react them together, and it was supposed to be a lot more meaningful than it was. But so far in this class, all we've been doing, I feel like, is talking about these little micro, tiny molecules. And most of the molecules that we actually come in contact each day are not tiny, they're freaking huge. And so I want to segue now. Instead of naming molecules, I want us to get good at identifying really massive molecules because I know in bio you've learned them. But now you know kind of the intricacies about their structure, so you can start to identify them and figure out, oh, that's why we've named it that thing, based on the little pieces that we talked about last unit. So microscopic is kind of the tiny things. Macroscopic is the big things that we see in the world around us. And most of the really large molecules can fit actually into three categories. And what's really interesting is we end up eating those three categories, and they're really important for the billions of reactions that are happening inside us at any given time. So the three big macro categories, macromolecules that we talk about. I'm going to switch to a different color here. The first one is what we call fat molecules. That's not super sciencey, so you'll hear people like refer to that, but that's simply referring to a type of molecule. In bio or biochem, we refer to those structures as lipids. And your doctor will refer to those structures as triglycerides. But they're all the same type of huge molecule. Another type is, again, we've heard all of this in terms of our food, are carbohydrates. And so we'll talk about what makes something that and why, at least for the reactions that we've got going in here, it's important to take those in. And then, wait, what's the other one? Mind blank. Oh, this is what we call proteins. All of these are super important to the function of all living things. So if we don't take one of those in, our chemical reactions that happen in our body don't have the reactants that they need in order to function. So I'm going to scroll because we're going to skip kind of a little bit of content. I wanted to talk today about the very first one. And again, fats is kind of the non-sciencey term for it. We talked about how organic molecules have C's and H's in it. Fats are still organic molecules. All of us produce these things naturally, even plants. But they have C's, they have H's and O's. And at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to try identifying the types of molecules that we're talking about. And so one of the things I would look at is the types of atoms that are present in it. We didn't talk about, last unit, a different functional group that's called an ester. An ester has the C double bond O, just like a carboxylic acid does. And, oh, I'm sorry, it's got this whole piece, the C double bond O and the O, except it's stuck in between two carbons, so it doesn't have an H at the end. In class, we would have made esters because they're responsible for all like flavors and smells. So any food that you eat, it's this type of molecule, the triglyceride, the lipid molecule, that's giving it the flavor. This is my favorite. I'm just going to say that. But remember how I just said that we call a fat molecule a triglyceride? This is what a fat molecule or a triglyceride actually looks like. Do you see how massive this thing is compared to the little like propane that we were drawing last unit? I'm never going to ask you to draw one of these. But again, another name for a fat molecule is a triglyceride. Do you see how we've got like three pieces here kind of coming off? That's where that name comes from. So I will never ask you to draw it, but I kind of think of like fat molecules as looking like a letter E. They're huge, but they're pretty compact. And so they store a ton of energy in all of these bonds that are there. So this is what our bodies use to store energy. Um, and without it, we would not live. This is one of the most important types of molecules we would have to take in. Um, I will tell you again, in order to make a triglyceride molecule, a fat molecule, your body takes what are called fatty acids, and we'll talk a little bit more about those, and it reacts them with a molecule that's called glycerol. Do you see how that ends in all? Glycerol, if I draw it, I'm going to switch colors. Glycerol has 3 carbons in it, and they're attached together, and it has 3 alcohol groups. This reacts with an acid, a carboxylic acid, 3 times to make an actual fat molecule. So plants do this reaction, humans do this reaction, and we call it a condensation reaction. In class, I'd ask you to draw this and we'd practice drawing it, but I'm not going to worry about that. But I just want you to know that when we take in any food, your body breaks a lot of those molecules down to produce this glycerol molecule, and then your body works really hard to kind of store all of the fatty acids that you're taking in your diet. So one of the terms I know that came up kind of looking at food labels, some people knew some things about saturated and some things about unsaturated. We talked last unit, not last unit, 3 units ago when we were talking about solutions. A saturated solution is one where you can't dissolve anymore. And unsaturated, you can dissolve more. As far as nutrition or food labels go, that's not at all what it has to do with. It doesn't have anything to do with dissolving. In science, in chem, in biochem, whenever anybody uses the term saturated, that means that it's all single bonds between carbons. So it's like a big alkane structure. When they say the term unsaturated, let me scroll up here, that means that there are double bonds between the carbons. So another term I just want to point out, remember how we were talking about how fatty acids react with glycerol with the 3 OH groups to make an actual fat molecule? This molecule right here, do you see how it has that carboxylic acid ending on it? Anything that has a carboxylic acid ending is going to end in the term acid. And then it's such a huge long carbon chain after it that they call it a fatty acid. It's like big molecule acid. So this structure that's up here, because it's all single bonds between carbons, and it's got a carboxylic acid group on the end, we call that a saturated fatty acid. We're down here, we call this guy, because it's got the carboxylic acid group on it, and it's got a double bond, we call that an unsaturated, because it's got a double bond present, fatty acid. And then what's even more interesting, if we count back from here, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do you see how that double bond is 6 from the end? On a food label, they would call this an omega-6 fatty acid, which is what's found in fish oil. An omega-3 fatty acid would have the double bond kind of coming off the third one. Your brain has to have these in order to repair any damage that's ever done to it from the neurons that are there. It's really essential to like brain health, and so that's where you'll hear people say like, oh, I take fish oil pills. I try to eat a lot of fish to get my omega-3 fatty acids in. So it's very important. So again, I want to point out carboxylic acid group, name will end in acid, really long carbon chain, we call it a fatty acid, and a double bond present between the carbons means it's unsaturated. If we scroll down, look at how we don't have a carboxylic acid group because there's no OH on it, and we've got kind of 3 of those pieces that are there. This is what we again call a saturated, because there's no double bond, I'm going to say saturated fat or a saturated triglyceride. Again, we've got those three pieces, so 3 fatty acids reacted with that glycerol to make it. If I compared that structurally to an unsaturated fat, there's this guy. Do you see how we've got all these hooks and kind of curves? Those double bonds kind of bend the structure. This one is called an unsaturated fat. So structurally, look at how this guy's huge, but it's pretty compact. This guy is huge, but then we've got kind of these like hooks that are taking place on the structure. Typically, people will say that saturated fats are more associated with like heart disease and kind of building up along the edges of your artery. So people will suggest that you limit the amount of saturated fats because they kind of pack really nicely. Where unsaturated fats don't. It's harder for your body to kind of store those pieces. So where we see these, because saturated fats form that nice kind of blocky shape, that's what mammals produce. So we all have saturated fats present. That's just what our body uses to store. Cheese is an example of that. Unsaturated fats is what plants produce. And the structure of those molecules affects the properties of them. So if I kind of scroll down here just to talk property-wise, saturated fats, because they form kind of nice blocky shapes and can stack and get compact really easily, they are always solids at room temp. So picture like looking at a steak and you see that white stuff along the side. That's what a saturated fat looks like. So think of like butter as an example of that. Unsaturated fats are usually liquids at room temp. So picture like olive oil, even like coconut oil is a solid, but as soon as it gets just a tiny bit of warmth to it, it turns into a liquid for you. Saturated fats all, I'm right, come from animals. Unsaturated all comes from plants. And there, I will say, is some of my favorite things to eat. So again, picture the structure, saturated, blocky shaped, unsaturated from a plant, all kind of hooked and like curvy, liquid. One of my favorite things to eat are what are called hydrogenated fats. And so if you picture like margarine, or my favorite thing is those tubs of frosting. I like Just by Vanilla and we'll eat that. Don't judge. You know how that's like creamy? We're able to react liquid fats, so unsaturated fats, and break some of the double bonds and add hydrogens onto them. We call that partially hydrogenating them. So it's taking something that behaves like a liquid and adding breaking double bonds onto it to make it behave more like an animal fat or a solid fat. So it changes the texture of the food, so we can control how creamy it is. So if you buy things like, I can't believe it's not butter, that's been hydrogenated to behave more like a solid, creamier animal fat. So if they take something that is unsaturated, and then they start breaking some of those double bonds by adding hydrogen onto it, do you see how it turns it into a more blocky texture? That gives us more of that creamy texture. So I'm going to ask that you open up the assignment for today and see if you can kind of identify the molecules as being a fatty acid versus a fat, and seeing if they are saturated or unsaturated is kind of our big goal.